a Horse was the first to expose the politics behind attempts to reopen horse slaughterhouses on U.S. soil. Vickery has also investigated the Bureau of Land Management's wild horse and livestock programs, exposed billionaires on Forbes' annual rich lists as the nation's top welfare ranchers, and pursued major news outlets spreading BLM wild horse disinformation. You can find her articles in Forbes, Newsweek, Salon, Counterpunch, The Daily Beast, Alternet, and The Daily Pitchfork. Please welcome Vickery Eckhoff.
Thanks so much, Eric, and I'm really grateful to be here to talk to you about what I have focused my investigative journalism on. This talk is on wild horses can drag us to better reporting on public lands, and I recognize that some of you in this room may not be a fan of the wild horse, but they're hugely popular with the American public, and they're even, the media loves them. Wild horses get a huge amount of media coverage, and unfortunately, most of it is terrible. But this opens up an opportunity for you guys in the environmental science community to provide a counter narrative to what is currently out there. So, Bureau of Land Management, you may question their management abilities and their policies, but they have a stellar public affairs team. And they have been running a disinformation campaign to zero out wild horses for quite a few years. And when I speak of disinformation, I'm not just speaking kind of in the general terms. People love to throw that term around. I'm speaking about deliberately false and misleading and deceptive information distributed by this agency to achieve a purpose. You will perhaps not be surprised to know that the most trusted news outlets out there and local news spread, misreport, and amplify BLM's wild horse claims. And when I'm talking about the most trusted news outlets, I'm talking about the biggest news provider, the Associated Press, PBS, NPR, the Washington Post, the New York Times. I have worked with journalists to get them to correct their errors, be them errors in interpretation or errors embedded within a BLM press release. They almost always refuse because their standard of reporting is, I accurately reported what the BLM said. So when I talk about reporters not fact-checking or correcting, it's because I've worked really hard with them to try and get them to do that. And I have succeeded in getting coverage taken off the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. That has gotten increasingly difficult. Anyway, the main BLM wild horse claims are that there are too many, they're overpopulated, they degrade rangeland, and that there's not enough food or water. Of course, as we know, no mention of public lands ranching, which has been the thread in this conference and the discussions about what to do about it. As I mentioned, reporters not fact-checking or correcting, and in fact, I had an Associated Press editor tell me that a source providing wrong dates and data, that was not getting their facts wrong. That editor told me that facts and dates and data are opinions, not facts. So if they get a date or an opinion, a date or a piece of data wrong, that's okay because it's someone's opinion. And they label that news. So one of the things that's going to make correcting these false narratives more difficult is that AI is replacing Google. And I don't know if any of you remember Wikipedia, but Wikipedia 15 years ago was the place where reporters went just to grab, some statement and throw it into an article and put a byline on it. Anyway, my message to you today is going to be all about the need for a counter-narrative that's science-based. Sorry, one second. So how does BLM disinformation spread? How does it take root? These are some numbers that I'm going to go through. 1,424, 289, 24, 15, and 175. 1424 is the number of BLM press releases on wild horses issued between 2016 and today. That is 13 a month. 298 of those are on wild horse roundups and gathers, and you can see on the chart the big leap between 2016 and 2017 in press releases. This correlates with the BLM's acceleration of wild horse roundups, and they've continued to put out a lot of press releases in general about wild horses. Sometimes they're about the adoption program, sometimes it's a call for comments, but every single one of them has the underlying message of wild horse overpopulation. Now, 24, that's that wild horse news cycle that these press releases are generating. They produce thousands of news stories cut and pasted from BLM press releases. And just looping back to the AI comment, AI is going to replace the BLM press release. For example, when I Googled, why does the BLM round up wild horses? AI tells me what BLM says on its press releases. But if I ask, who does more damage, cattle, livestock, or wild horses, it mentions that livestock is more damaging. Of course, as a journalist who knows this issue, I know the right questions to ask, but almost every journalist and every reporter that gets into this for the first time gets it all wrong because of who they use as a source. Now, a single wild horse article licensed from the Associated Press by 175 news outlets enabled the BLM to mislead and deceive the public about the true threat to public lands, which is livestock. And the Associated Press, by the way, knows about public lands ranching, but it does not report it. Of course, roundups get the most coverage. And when I Google BLM roundups, of course, there's you can scroll for pages and pages and find articles and news, broadcasts showing the controversy and the helicopters and, broken necks and broken legs. That gets a ton of coverage. And by the way, I just want to state that I am not a wild horse advocate. My advocacy is for the public's right to be properly informed. So many of these stories are being put out every day, very popular. The media isn't covering them or speaking truth to power as much as they are monetizing the wild horses situation. And this is just a screenshot of my desktop that I scrolled through, showing just how many of these stories there are. They're endless. This is what a BLM press release BLM news release or press release looks like. They tend to run about 750 pages. They're 750 words, sorry, not pages. And they always drop them 5 to 7 days before a roundup. And of course, we always know when the roundups are going to be started because the BLM puts out a schedule. So if you really want to see what the BLM's message is right before they round up, you get it from this press release 5 to 7 days in advance. So what does this include? Now, this press release is for the, it's for the Triple B Complex Roundup. And so all of this information is pretty consistent from press release to press release on wild horses. And it consists of boilerplate in which the BLM substitutes in, a different HMA, where it's located, the appropriate management level, what the estimated population is, and then they feed in these repetitive messages to build a storyline about wild horses being overpopulated, in excess, 4 times above AML, more than the land can support, are associated with rangeland damage. FYI, if you look at a lot of wild horse reporting by the Associated Press, when they're calling out the wild horses for being starving, the photos always show them being nice and fat. The other part of the BLM's message is to portray itself as science-based, authoritative, caring, transparent, humane, protective, that they uphold the law, they're accountable, and trustworthy. So, one of the other statements that is in every BLM press release about a roundup is, why are they doing this? Why are they gathering these wild horses? So, I've spoken about BLM's press releases being intentionally deceptive and misleading. So you might be wondering, okay, where's the intentionally deceptive, false, and misleading information in the press release you just saw that's kind of, boilerplate for all the BLM roundup press releases? Before I give you that answer, I want to just point out that BLM press releases don't say that wild horses degrade rangeland. They don't say that. They could say it, but they can't because their agency data does not support it. And Chandra was speaking before about Pierre's work on the impacts of livestock grazing and how rangeland health conditions can be gleaned from a digital map. And so this is just the same as what she previously showed. And if I have read your information correctly, livestock, according to BLM data, cause 72% of failing rangeland monitored by the BLM, and under 1% is a combination of wild horses and livestock. So this is how the BLM explains roundups to the media. The purpose of the gather is to prevent undue or unnecessary degradation of the public lands associated with excess wild horses. That is some really carefully crafted language to mislead. It's a true statement, but it's deceptive and misleading. So, okay, so if there's undue or unnecessary degradation, that's the wild horses, that's under 1%. The due and necessary degradation that they're going to completely ignore is the 72% of failing livestock damage that their data shows. Now, here's a second statement made in BLM press releases on wild horse gatherers, that they prevent further degradation of public land. So again, what they're doing is they're removing the additive impact. And I will say that this is pretty consistent. They're not saying they do it. They say, well, there's some degradation associated with excess wild horses. Well, who's associating them, the wild horses, with that excess damage? The BLM. Now, this is a completely false statement. Removing excess animals would enable significant progress toward achieving the standards for rangeland health identified by the Northern Great Basin Resource Advisory Council. They may consider that achieving a reduction in a potential under 1% amount of failing rangeland is not, maybe that's significant progress for the Bureau of Land Management, but how is the public supposed to read that statement? Here's a BLM press release that was picked up by the Billings Gazette on May 16th. On the left side, we have the BLM press release. On the right side, we have the Billings Gazette story. And you'll see in the middle the common phrases that the reporter has picked up from the press release and used in his reporting about excess wild horses, wild horse populations exceeding the established appropriate management level, and especially the reporter has condensed all the different statements that BLM has made about preventing possible damage or further damage into this statement. BLM cited concerns about horse overpopulation damaging the ecosystem and impacts to other wildlife as reasons for the gather. I want to mention at this time that whenever I see these stories, I use Pierre's map to go to the HMA where the wild horse roundup is about to have and to assess how what rangeland health standards are for that HMA and the underlying or overlying grazing allotment. And I almost always find that either the territory with the wild horses and the allotment is either failing due to livestock usage, or they're meeting all health conditions. The worst reporting on wild horses is from PBS. And in July 2023, myself and two other people in this room and a filmmaker, a noted filmmaker, caught wind of them about to broadcast this series called The Human Footprint, in which episode 1 was on invasive species. So we reached out to them in advance. We knew some of what they were going to cover, and we warned them of the errors that they were about to broadcast. And anyway, so the first episode features Burmese pythons, Asian carp, wild horses, and feral hogs. And it claimed, the production team claimed, that there were 300,000 wild horses on BLM land, even though at the time, BLM.gov's estimate was 59,000 wild horses. So they vastly overstated the population. They got their information from the Journal of Wildlife Management article that was talking about all free-roaming horses on tribal lands, in the Theodore Roosevelt State Park up in the Dakotas. And they did not even see in the small print that BLM wild horses are a distinct legal entity and that they were a small subset. They completely missed that. They went on to call the wild horses invasive, European invaders that don't belong, that ravage the fragile landscape and destroy water sources. And I will tell you that I did a report, 15-page report with help from the people I mentioned previously, 15 pages, and a complete storyboard examining all the footage. And what I saw was that PBS's footage shows cattle grazing alongside wild horses in a grazing allotment / HMA, never mentions livestock at all. The other thing is that this segment was called, the wild horse part of it was about 12 minutes, and it was called The Wild Horses of Nevada's Desert. The production crew shot their footage not in Nevada, but in Utah and California. And they even mention on screen, well, despite their giant numbers, these horses are very elusive. Well, they were unable to find enough of them to shoot for their broadcast, so they went to a wild horse sanctuary and they shot footage there, and then they represented those horses on screen to viewers as wild. That is a deliberate deceiving of the public. We worked with with PBS for a year to try and get them to correct this. We worked with the public editor, who eventually issued an article saying that the segment had failed the audience. We wrote to the president with this report, 15 pages. You can have a copy if you want one. And we contacted every member of PBS's board to ask them to correct this information or remove it from the first episode. They didn't even acknowledge what we sent them. And we later found out that they were chasing an Emmy. They were nominated for an Emmy. They didn't get one. And they labeled this show a science documentary. So that's just an example of some of the disinformation spread by the BLM, but augmented by an inattentive and resource-challenged media. So this is the opportunity for you to provide a scientific counter-narrative about public lands ranching, as PEER did with its BLM rangeland health mapping project. Journalists contacted in the past with information on PEER's work reported differently on wild horses. They mentioned the livestock damage, and then that particular reporter stopped reporting on wild horses. He worked for the Salt Lake Tribune. We know that roundups are scheduled well in advance, and we know when the BLM press releases are going to go out. And this gives us an opportunity to contact reporters at that time with a new science-based perspective. So this is an opportunity to put out a press release with the BLM's information at the top and the scientific assessment of livestock grazing at the bottom, which never appears in any news article. The most they ever do is ask a wild horse group. They oftentimes mention public lands ranching, but they don't delve into it. So this is an opportunity to get public lands ranching piggybacked onto wild horse reporting and get public lands ranching into the public consciousness. It's an opportunity for you to gain access as a trusted source to the media, for your group, for your issue, for your expertise, and everyone benefits. The public benefits, public lands, wildlife, your group, media reporting, wild horses, and most important to me, the truth. I became a journalist because I wanted to speak truth to power, and not enough people are doing that, and you can be a part of that effort. So thank you.